I got a call from my then agent saying, look, they're making this film of Lord of the Rings. It's going to be 2 weeks' work, and they want someone to do the voice for a digital character in Lord of the Rings. And they then said, well, it's the character Gollum. And I thought, oh, I remembered Gollum because I'd read Gollum in The Hobbit when I was at school. Well, it's going to be a little bit of, doing a voice. You're doing a voiceover for a digital character. And I said, well, look, Lord of the Rings has got a dozen really good parts in it. Can you not get me up for something decent? I'm not a voice actor, and I don't really want to do a voice for a digital character.
Out of every actor in The Lord of the Rings, Andy Serkis took on the biggest risk. Originally thinking this would be an easy 2-week voice acting gig, Andy ended up committing more than 1.5 years of his life away from his family, shedding his blood, sweat, and tears for the Lord of the Rings production, all while knowing that his face would never be seen on screen. Plus, he took on the risk of using a brand new technology, which had just come out of the medical field, called motion capture, a technology that was unproven and could have yielded disastrous results if done incorrectly. But instead, 25 years later, Andy Serkis is known as the undisputed pioneer of the performance capture industry, having acted in multiple blockbuster franchises and proven that performance capture is exactly that, a performance, not just some pixels on a screen. But how did he get here? What led him to acting, and how did he land the role that would launch him into cinematic history? And why was his time in New Zealand so incredibly difficult compared to his castmates? My name is Gibby, and this is episode 9 in my Becoming series, where I tell you about how your favorite actors became your favorite characters. So sit back, relax, grab a pint or some Old Toby, and enjoy this deep dive into Andy Serkis's long and perilous journey to becoming Gollum. To truly understand the tortured dual personality of Gollum and Smeagol, we first have to look at the deeply divided childhood of the man who brought them to life. Born Andrew Clement Serkis in the spring of 1964 in Greater London, Andy's upbringing was incredibly unique and culturally dichotomous. His mother, Lily, was a teacher dedicated to instructing disabled children in the English suburbs, while his Iraqi-Armenian father, Clement, was a fiercely driven doctor. Clement spent much of Andy's early life working abroad, pouring his energy into building a civilian hospital in Baghdad. Because of this, a young Andy spent his childhood constantly traveling back and forth between the quiet Catholic suburbs of England and the bustling, vibrant cities of the Middle East. But this worldly, cosmopolitan upbringing took a deeply traumatic turn when Andy was just 10 years old. During the political unrest surrounding the rise of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, Andy's father was suddenly imprisoned. He vanished into a black bag, and for 2 agonizing months, the Serkis family was completely unaware of whether Clement was even alive. Thankfully, his father was eventually released and forced to flee the country, but those 2 months permanently altered Andy's worldview. This early, terrifying exposure to the consequences of corrupted power left a profound mark on him. It instilled in him an enduring feeling of being an outsider, someone who never quite fit into one perfectly defined box. But it also forged a deep, intrinsic empathy for the vulnerable and the oppressed. Without even knowing it, the emotional foundation for playing deeply flawed, tragically corrupted characters was already being laid. Despite this well of emotion, Andy never actually set out to be an actor. He wanted to be a painter. When he enrolled at Lancaster University in 1982, his focus was entirely on the visual arts and graphic design. He only joined the university's theater module as a subsidiary class, perfectly content to stay backstage, designing posters, painting sets, and building props. But then he was convinced to step in front of the audience for a student production of a play called Gotcha, where he was cast as a rebellious, deeply troubled teenager holding a teacher hostage. The experience was an epiphany for Andy. Stepping into the shoes of another person provided a visceral release that Andy had never felt before. It allowed him to channel his feelings of being an outsider into something tangible and entirely liberating. Acting essentially unlocked a profound sense of play and purpose for him, prompting him to completely reconstruct his college degree to major in theater, performance, and set design. After graduating, Andy threw himself into the grind of the typical working-class stage actor. He apprenticed at the local Duke's Playhouse in Lancaster, performing an exhausting gauntlet of 14 back-to-back plays. He worked for virtually no money, but throughout the 1990s he established himself as a gritty and fiercely dedicated actor of the British theatre circuit. But his talents weren't just limited to theatre. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, Andy built a rock-solid resume on screen as well. He appeared in over a dozen British television shows like Streetwise and the 1999 adaptation of Oliver Twist, and he acted in around 10 indie films. He had established himself as a dedicated character actor who prided himself on throwing his entire physical being into every single performance, whether in front of a live audience or a camera. He was a purist of the physical craft, entirely uninterested in taking roles that didn't allow him to fully embody the character, saying himself that he was never much of a voice actor and always had to get into character through method acting, which is exactly why when his agent called him in 1999 about a quick 2-week voiceover job for a computer-animated fantasy creature, Andy didn't immediately jump at the opportunity. When Andy heard the pitch, he was highly skeptical. As an actor who thrived on intense physicality, the idea of standing alone in a sterile sound booth felt like a massive step backward in his career. He viewed the offer as a mere cartoon voice gig, but despite his reservations, he still prepared for the audition, because after all, acting is a job and a gig is a gig, so why not go for it? And after he had gone home, he realized that this character Gollum was one he was familiar with because he had read The Hobbit, although he hadn't read The Lord of the Rings at this point. And once he realized who this character was and how impactful they were to the story, he then got a little bit more involved. Andy always anchored his performances in his body, as we've already discussed, and he found out that Gollum was called Gollum because of the voice his throat made. On top of this, he knew that the One Ring had a toxic hold on the creature, and he wanted the physicality of the character to represent that toxic relationship. As he was thinking about all of this, Andy watched one of his 3 cats, Diz, violently heave and cough up a furball on the floor. No joke, that is exactly where he got the bodily spasm for Gollum from. He realized that this movement, desperately trying to expel something painful from within, was the perfect physiological and psychological metaphor for Gollum's crippling addiction. He threw this feral, choking physicality into his initial audition, leaving the casting directors in absolute shock.
I then went home and I started I dug out my old copy of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and started to have a look. And of course I fell in love with the character again. Suddenly I had to find a way into this character, and I'm thinking, how am I going to approach this? I was thinking, well, physically, how am I going to find this? And this is gospel truth. My cat came into the room, came into my kitchen and started coughing up a furball. Like that. So I went in for the audition and jumped up on the chair and sort of started doing, it was a sort of a version of that for the casting director, John Hubbard, who sat there and he was reading off lines and he just went.
This brilliant, full-body commitment secured him a face-to-face meeting with director Peter Jackson and co-writer and producer Fran Walsh. And it was in this meeting that everything changed. Andy immediately fell in love with Peter and Fran as people and completely bought into their collaborative spirit. He became so passionate about the character that he told them he would do anything to physically embody the role. He offered to starve himself, lose massive amounts of weight, and completely destroy his body just so he could play Gollum in live action. But Peter and Fran had to gently break the news to him that it just wasn't possible. Tolkien's description of Gollum's emaciated, unnaturally corrupted, and elongated form simply could never be achieved with practical makeup on a human frame. The character had to be digital. However, Peter and Fran had zero interest in a standard voice acting gig. They ultimately persuaded Andy to provide the voice and drive the motion capture for the character. This was a massive leap of faith. At the time, motion capture was a brand new technology that had just come out of the medical field, where it was primarily used for studying biomechanics and physical therapy. It was totally unproven in a massive cinematic blockbuster, but desperate to work with Peter and Fran, Andy accepted the challenge. Before we dive into the forging of Gollum in the heart of New Zealand with Andy Serkis crawling through freezing rivers, scaring tourists, and drinking Gollum juice, I wanted to briefly introduce myself, as I know a lot of you coming into the series have never watched the channel before. My name is Gibby, and this is Fact or Fantasy, a place where I talk about all things Lord of the Rings and Tolkien, movies and books. If you're new to the channel and are enjoying this video so far, then why not like and subscribe? It helps these videos reach more people, and it also helps you stay tuned for more awesome content coming in the future. Okay, now that I've introduced myself and you know who you're watching, I'll leave you to the rest of the video. Enjoy. When Andy arrived in New Zealand to begin filming, he didn't start at the beginning. One of the interesting parts about the fact that they filmed all 3 movies at once is that they filmed all of their scenes completely out of order, which meant that Andy, along with Elijah Wood and Sean Astin, started their filming on Mount Doom. He says that it was around scene 729 or something like that, the scene when Frodo and Sam are walking up Mount Doom and getting attacked by Gollum. This meant that he had to embody this worn and weary creature without having built up to that moment with other scenes first. Stepping onto set into a white unitard, he instantly dropped into his twitching persona, utterly baffling the crew who were unsure if this whole thing would work. Because motion capture was so new, many of the camera operators and crew members didn't understand why an actor was writhing on the ground in a unitard. Meanwhile, Peter Jackson cracked jokes behind the monitors to ease the tension, knowing that history was being made. Andy's performance was so visceral and emotionally connected that it actually forced Jackson to mandate a massive pivot in production. He ordered the visual effects team at Weta Digital to completely redesign their existing CGI model of Gollum. If you didn't know, Gollum originally wasn't going to look like what we see on screen today. His face looked totally different, but after seeing how good Andy Serkis was with his facial acting, Peter Jackson knew that they had to map Gollum's face onto Andy's own facial bone structure, ensuring that the actor's literal soul and micro-expressions translated directly into the digital avatar. Gollum was no longer just a digital creation, he was intrinsically bound to Andy Serkis. But the reality of taking a delicate technology born in a sterile medical lab and dragging it through the rugged, freezing wilderness of New Zealand was about to push Andy's body to its absolute breaking point. To successfully translate Gollum from the pages of a book into a living, breathing entity, Andy pushed himself to the limits of his physical endurance. A true method actor at heart, he decided the best way to figure out the creature's unique biomechanics was to live them. He spent hours on his days off walking and crawling on all fours through the rugged New Zealand wilderness. Naturally, this led to some incredibly awkward encounters. Whenever Andy accidentally stumbled across local hikers while scrambling over rocks on all fours, he would immediately drop character and pretend he was searching for a lost item in the dirt, desperate to avoid explaining why a grown man was scurrying around through the brush like a goblin. Once he was actually in front of the cameras along Elijah Wood and Sean Astin, things only got tougher. Now, just to be clear, it's a common misconception that Andy wore his dot-covered Lycra motion capture suit out in the wilderness. In reality, he only wore that specific high-tech suit when he was inside the sterile motion capture studio doing his solo shots. While acting on location with his co-stars, he wore a normal skin-tight white suit that the visual effects team would later digitally paint out of the frame. And because of his complete uninhibited commitment to Gollum's erratic physical movements, crawling on the ground and over rocks, that pristine white suit ended up becoming extremely dirty, beaten up, and destroyed by the end of filming. And because of his immense dedication to his craft, his co-stars deeply understood the sacrifice that he was making. Elijah Wood later expressed massive gratitude for Andy, noting that instead of just reading lines off camera, Andy was the physical embodiment of the character, driving the emotional weight of the scenes for the rest of the cast. The way that things had been done in the film industry in years past regarding CGI characters acting alongside live action was way different than the way Peter Jackson was doing things for The Lord of the Rings. Previously, they would usually just have a tennis ball on a stick that the actor would have to look at for their visual cue. That would make things extremely difficult, as an actor like Elijah Wood, for example, would have to look at a tennis ball and act like something was in front of him. You can see that it would be really hard to create emotion in a scene if you're staring at a tennis ball. So despite Andy Serkis getting painted out of the scenes, he was really on set to help Elijah Wood and Sean Astin bring emotion to their acting. He gave them a real, tortured soul to act against, rather than just read lines to a tennis ball. And he fully committed to the physical reality of the scene. Elijah Wood talks about how Andy Serkis was so committed that he would often spit while he was talking. There's a scene in The Two Towers when Sam is making the rabbit stew that Gollum spits in disgust, and Andy Serkis proudly says that that saliva you see flying in the air isn't CGI. It's 100% Andy Serkis. But spitting at stew was a walk in the park compared to the environmental extremes of the shoot. While the rest of the cast wore intricate armor, heavy robes, and warm cloaks, Andy was completely exposed to the elements. The shoots were brutal for him. For instance, while filming scenes set in the rugged landscapes of Ithilien, where Gollum is catching a fish in the river, unseasonal snow hit the mountain. The crew actually had to spend hours just melting the snow away with heaters and hot water just so they could film the scene. Wearing only a wetsuit underneath his unitard, Andy had to scramble through the freezing glacial water, all while happily eating a disgusting synthetic prop fish. He later joked that the freezing temperatures and the intense exertion made him genuinely fear he was going to suffer a heart attack right there in the river. On top of that, there was a 200-foot drop at the end of that river where a waterfall was, and Peter Jackson purposefully positioned 2 crew members down there just in case Andy got a little too carried away and almost went over the edge. And that gelatin prop fish? Andy said that he would have rather had a real raw fish than that thing. But beyond the physical contortions, freezing rivers, and disgusting prop fish, the vocal toll was immense. Replicating that violent, cat-hacking vocalization for hours on end subjected his vocal cords to serious trauma, frequently leaving his throat raw and inflamed. To prevent his throat from actively bleeding and causing permanent damage, he had to constantly consume massive daily quantities of what the crew dubbed Gollum juice, a piping hot, highly concentrated elixir of water, fresh ginger, lemon, and honey.
Andy.
Hey!
It's a strong brew, so you can put more hot water in it to careful it's really hot.
You see, I can't speak like Gollum until I've drank this special Gollum juice. And then afterwards...
Careful it's hot.
I just don't like this. This is great, thank you very much.
See you, Smeagol.
The visceral, exhausting intensity of the shoot occasionally boiled over, causing some very real on-set friction. For instance, during the scene at the Black Gate when Gollum yanks Frodo and Sam backwards off the rocks, Andy accidentally grabbed onto Sean Astin's glued-on Hobbit wig and pulled it off completely. The mistake caused actual physical pain for Sean, prompting the furious and exhausted actor to temporarily walk off the set to recover. After all, their wigs were braided into their actual hair and then glued on, so not only was it painful to have ripped off, but it would take hours to get back on properly. I can kinda understand Sean's frustration there, but hey, stuff like that happens in the heat of the moment. Even beyond the freezing glacial rivers, the torn wigs, and agonizing vocal strain, the true toll of playing Gollum was emotional. And this brings us right back to the central thread of Andy's childhood. Growing up, his father was largely absent. First, due to his dedicated medical work abroad, and later because of his terrifying imprisonment in Iraq. Because of that early exposure to isolation, Andy had sworn to himself that he would always be a present, grounded father to his own kids. However, this intense multi-year shoot in New Zealand kept him on the other side of the planet, far away from his wife and children. He wrestled with immense residual paternal guilt, terrified that he was repeating the same cycle of absence that he had felt as a boy. But in a beautiful, heartbreaking testament to his craft, Andy took every ounce of that profound loneliness, guilt, and isolation and channeled it directly into Gollum's tortured portrayal. He endured the physical extremes and confronted his own deepest fears to forge a character that felt breathtakingly real. And in doing so, he sparked a technological revolution that would not only change his career, but the entire landscape of modern cinema. When The Two Towers finally hit theaters, the world instantly saw the results of that revolution. Audiences weren't just looking at a computer-generated monster, they were looking into the eyes of a deeply conflicted, tragically real being. Andy had successfully proven that performance capture was, at its core, pure acting. But changing the landscape of cinema didn't come without a fight. In the aftermath of the film's release, Andy found himself in the middle of a fierce industry feud with traditional animators. Many visual effects artists felt their painstaking frame-by-frame work was being overlooked when Andy used the term digital makeup to describe the process. But despite the backlash, Andy firmly stood his ground, successfully being the champion of motion capture as a legitimate co-authored performance art. And while the industry debated the technicalities of his role, the person who understood his creative impact the most was the man who hired him. Peter Jackson trusted Andy's deep understanding of this new digital pipeline and emotional pacing so completely that he handed him the directorial reins for the opening sequence of The Return of the King. Directing the tragic struggle between Smeagol and Deagle, Andy made the brilliant, bold choice to strip away the musical score entirely, emphasizing the raw, grounded reality of the One Ring's corrupting power. After The Lord of the Rings, he went on to co-found the Imaginarium Studios to advance virtual production, cementing his legacy by providing the soul for some of the greatest digital characters in cinematic history. He even traveled to Rwanda to study wild mountain gorillas to prepare for his role in King Kong, and later delivered an absolute masterclass in nonverbal acting as the revolutionary ape leader Caesar in the Planet of the Apes. But his profound depth as an actor was never limited to digital rendering. He seamlessly translated his intense screen presence into major live-action franchise roles as well, playing the chaotic Ulysses Klaue in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Alfred Pennyworth in The Batman, and delivering an emotionally shattering performance as Kino Loy in Star Wars Andor. Yet for all his diverse roles, Andy's connections to Tolkien's world remains unparalleled. During the 2020 lockdowns, he performed a continuous 11-hour charity livestream reading The Hobbit to raise money for COVID relief, flawlessly adopting different voices for every single character. The Hobbitathon was a massive success, raising around £300,000 for charity. Recognizing his incredible dedication, the Tolkien Estate and HarperCollins granted him the rare honor of officially recording brand new, unabridged audiobooks for The Hobbit, the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, and eventually The Silmarillion, voicing over 130 characters in Tolkien's Legendarium. This massive undertaking cemented him not just as the definitive Gollum, but as a defining voice for an entirely new generation of Tolkien readers. And now the journey has come completely full circle. Andy is returning to the very landscapes that defined him, starring as Gollum once more. But this time, his impact is so foundational to the DNA of Middle-earth that he isn't just acting, he is directing the upcoming feature, The Lord of the Rings: The Hunt for Gollum. When you look back at his entire career, the greatest irony is how close he came to turning it all down. The working-class stage actor who initially scoffed at the idea of a 3-week cartoon voice gig ended up completely hijacking the medium. Instead of standing comfortably in a sterile sound booth, he crawled through the freezing mud of New Zealand, poured his soul into an unproven technology, and pioneered a massive industry revolution. The man who was once reluctant to even step foot in Middle-earth has now become the ultimate guardian of its cinematic legacy. So what do you think of Andy's incredible journey to Middle-earth and his evolution into the pioneer of performance capture? And who should I cover next in this series? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Also, if you enjoyed this deep dive, please drop a like and subscribe, and maybe share this with a Tolkien-loving friend. I want to give a massive shout out to Joshua, Timothy, RoboSteve, Drix, Maha, and the rest of my incredible Patreon and YouTube members who help make these videos possible every month. As always, I appreciate you, you matter, and Jesus loves you. I'll see you guys in the next video.